finding out about the truth through what they're saying. Just like you might have some traditional Catholics, to use an analogy, who, may not be of the best of intentions all the time, but some people might benefit from some of the things that they have to say because they are true. And so to assert that this means that he's justifying or endorsing the preaching of people who are absolutely separated from the church, I believe that's reading into it something that's not there.
I don't know. He seems to be okay with the fact that the gospel is being preached, whatever the motive might be, because I think it transcends the messenger. I think it's bigger than the vessel that presents it.
Well, as long as the core truths are intact, yeah. I would agree that it's important for people to benefit from that, and that people can benefit from that, despite maybe less than ideal intentions of the people who are always preaching it. So I don't see how that presents any problem.
Now, Peter was no doubt a prominent apostle. I mean, and I would say probably chief of the 12, but of course, because of he had that type of personality. He was the quickest and the first to rush into righteousness and doing something wonderful, as well as he was the quickest to rush into error and folly, as we'll get into that later on. But I think, it would be good for the listeners if you could briefly just explain the sedevacantist issue, because I don't know if you're aware of this, you probably are, but almost nobody even knows this issue exists. And for decades I've been hearing messages on Christian radio and Protestant pastors even teaching about the Catholic Church and the papacy, and not once have I heard a peep about this. It was only in the last year that I even knew that there was such a thing, which is pretty unthinkable considering it's probably been going on for quite some time. Now, according to the sedevacantists, the last legitimate pope was Pius what, the 12th?
Correct.
Okay. If you could briefly explain that issue, because I'm almost certain,
well,
maybe the people that go to your website would know about it, but almost nobody else has any idea that this is even exists, and I think it is relevant for the papacy itself.
Yeah, I'm able and willing to do that, but I guess my impression was that we were going to be debating the biblical merits of the papacy,
okay.
and so, I just preferred this way it would have more of a universal application for people looking for the biblical arguments. I mean, if you want to bring up something about that in your argument, that's, up to you. But I don't necessarily prefer to spend a lot of time talking about that in this particular debate, because I thought we were going to be discussing the biblical issues,
Okay, all right then.
So did you want to ask a question or go for 2 minutes, and I could respond, or do you want to just continue free form?
Just free form. Like I said, Peter was no doubt a prominent apostle, probably the chief of the 12, but I can't find a single verse in Scripture where he's ever viewed by anybody as being the head of the entire universal church. I mean, to omit a statement like that, any kind of clear, definitive teaching statement, nobody ever seems to refer to him in this way. Yeah, he is singled out in a number of cases, but for nobody to explain him in this way is really unthinkable, considering what was taught 1,300 years later, that you have to actually submit to this one person for salvation. And we'll be talking about unum sanctum, because there's some stuff in there, because I think if a pope were to teach something that was clearly unbiblical, and you'd probably agree with this, if a pope taught something that was clearly unbiblical, he could not profess to be a legitimate successor to the chief of the apostles, if such a thing existed. So I can't find anything, if you could point out anywhere in the Scripture where anyone refers to Peter as the head of the church, or if there is any one head of the church. I see people operating independently of him a great deal, and not ever seeming to defer to his authority. So is there any verse like that?
Well, absolutely. But I think that we must clarify that what we're looking for here is the content of the office, not necessarily a specific name or a specific word, just like the word Trinity is not in the Bible, but the reality of the Trinity is absolutely there. And so it would be specious to say, well, I don't see the word Trinity clearly set forth in the Bible anywhere, and therefore to dismiss the doctrine. The doctrine is the reality there, is the equivalent teaching there, and the answer is absolutely. In John 20:15-17, he clearly entrusts Jesus Christ himself, clearly entrusts to St. Peter all of his sheep. And we know from Matthew 25 and all kinds of other passages that the sheep are his church, that the members of his church. And he says, and what's very interesting about this passage, he says, unto Peter alone, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Okay, John 21:15-17. And in John 21:16, the second command of the three, he uses the word there, poimene, in Greek, which means to tend or rule. It's the same word that's used in Revelation 2:27, where it says of Jesus, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And so Jesus Christ himself, okay, there can be no better witness, says that Peter is to rule the sheep alone among the apostles, and he gives him the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And of course, this language, and I would expect that most people are familiar with Matthew 16 who are listening to this, but if not, they need to consult Matthew 16:16 through 19, where Jesus singles out Peter among the apostles, and he says to thee, thou art Peter, upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it, and I will give to thee the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever thou shalt bind upon earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose upon earth shall be loosed in heaven. And the language here is borrowed from Isaiah 22, and the language of the prime minister. Okay, in David's kingdom there was a royal cabinet, but among the royal cabinet there was one prime minister, and we read in Isaiah chapter 22 that this prime minister had the key to the house of David. And it says of him, quote, Isaiah 22:20-22, and the key of the house of David will I lay upon his shoulder, so he shall open and none shall shut, and he shall shut and none shall open, end quote. It's basically saying the exact same thing in slightly different words, that Jesus says to Peter, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, whatever you loose upon earth shall be loosed in heaven. And so he's giving him the keys. The prime minister in the kingdom in the Old Testament had the key. And what did that represent? That represented that he had authority over the house of the king. Jesus is the king. He's entrusting the authority over his kingdom to St. Peter. That's clearly what's being said there in Matthew 16. And so even though the word papacy isn't there, the office is clearly set forth. And one last thing, and I'll allow you to respond, is that since this is so clearly borrowed from Isaiah 22, Jesus is saying that he's the head of my kingdom, my spiritual kingdom. He represents my authority on earth. And in the Old Testament, the prime minister had successors. And so it follows that St. Peter would have successors in this office. So if you wanted to respond to that.
Okay, as far as Peter being the rock in that Matthew 16 question, according to a source I have, of the original church fathers, somebody brought a report to Vatican I in 1870 that 17 of the original church fathers understood that to be Peter, but 8 said it was the apostles, 44 said it was his confession of faith, among them Origen and Chrysostom, and 16, including Augustine and Jerome and Gregory the Great, interpreted the rock to be Christ himself, and for a few they thought it meant the faithful in general. I don't believe that, but if it meant Peter, there would have to be some kind of clear corroborating statement somewhere else. As for the reference to the Matthew 16, the reference to Eliakim, to say that is clear is certainly a stretch, because it isn't clear. Because when I first started reading the Bible, one of the things I noticed, I started reading the New Testament, and there wasn't any church around. I was just reading it. And so obviously the first book I was reading was Matthew. I was struck immediately by how relentlessly and faithfully Matthew would mention every time an Old Testament type was fulfilled or a prophecy or something. It goes on and on and on, down to the minutest details of which, and I would never say that any of them were not important, but details which you could certainly be saved without knowing, or that are not utterly vital for you to know. Like, although all of them bolster the case, every prophecy that's fulfilled strengthens the case that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. But the amount of money he was betrayed for, what happened to Judas, and every little prophecy along the way, the murder of the babes of Bethlehem, Matthew lays them all out. For him to come to this portion, Matthew 16, and neglect to mention the prime minister